to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So, Tim, how were the storms in Sacramento over the weekend?
Well, I definitely was out in the pouring rain a couple of times yesterday with my rake, unclogging the drains to lessen what I like to call Lake 3rd Avenue when because I live in an older neighborhood, and so the gutters are narrower. So typically in even a moderate storm, you get a little bit of, kind of a big puddle that forms at my corner. And so yesterday I noticed each of the neighbors did their turn and they were out unclogging their gutters in front of their house. But this morning it had all subsided and it was not, for what they called a 200-year storm.
Yeah. How bad was it? I mean, we've got some rain now. It's not too bad. I guess your storm is coming south, but what's this like? This 200-year-old, once in 200-year-old storm. What is that like?
Well, it wasn't bad wind-wise. There certainly were wind gusts, but not like what you would expect from a major storm, at least in Sacramento. But we got the record. It was the all-time record for one day of rain in Sacramento's history, recorded history at least. It was 5.44 inches of rain yesterday.
Wow. That's
24 hours of Sunday.
It must have been just a deluge. Our graphic designer, Dana Beagle, just bought a new house in Sacramento. She's got a pool and her pool flooded. Poor thing. So she's exhausted this morning. Yeah, I don't even know how you deal with that.
No, I had a little bit of water in my garage. I have a detached garage. And when there's a big storm, I usually get a little water. I mean, not a major amount. So I, a couple of times, swept that out. And this morning there was a little left and I swept that out. But otherwise, other than my 2 trips out there, unclogging my gutters, which was great fun. And certainly I went through 2 sets of clothes yesterday, drenched in my poor raincoat. I used a different raincoat this morning because I think it will take a while for that one I wore yesterday to dry off.
I guess the big question is, does this make a dent on the drought?
Well, of course, every politician and every quote unquote water official was already out there yesterday. And I write about this on the blog this week saying just because we got record rain and a 200-year storm doesn't mean we're out of the drought. And really what they're saying is, these droughts, yes, Mother Nature certainly contributes to them, but they're largely politician created. Just imagine if we had the water storage that we the voters in 2014 authorized to build new above ground water storage projects. Just imagine how much of this water we could have captured if we had been diligent in doing our part. Remember, water, it's both for certainly capturing the water. It's also important for flood control, too. Now, we were very lucky yesterday, but so hopefully this storm will, get politicians thinking, hey, we finally need to do it. We certainly have the money these days, both in the bond measure that voters enacted and certainly in our budget treasury these days, but it requires the will of politicians to do it. And I don't know that we're going to see that anytime soon.
Well, my weekend wasn't as eventful as yours. Well, maybe it was. It was my mother's birthday. She turned 91. So Thursday morning, I took the day off. I went to see her. Then I went to the Order of Malta Gala and investiture on Friday. Listeners might remember the Order of Malta is an ancient Catholic order that started even before the Crusades in 1048. And it's a service organization that serves the poor and the sick. But then on Saturday, I went to the Claremont Institute Gala, and their keynote speaker was Ron DeSantis. And I guess from a perspective of a former speechwriter, I thought he gave a pretty good speech. In the beginning, he gave what sounded like a stump speech, his accomplishments in Florida, and that was okay. But the speech got better the back half when he talked about the issues confronting us nationally. I would have probably compressed the section on Florida accomplishments. And we've heard it all, and it doesn't really help us Californians. In fact, it makes us a bit jealous socialist, but I would have started off with the big issues. Otherwise, it was a pretty good speech.
And what kind of crowd did they have? I mean, we're always curious about our events going back to normal, and certainly baseball games and concerts and things like that are going back to normal. Did things seem back to normal from the attendees?
The gala was in Huntington Beach, so in Orange County, and Orange County doesn't have the mask mandate. So, well, I don't know if they have the mask mandate, but nobody wore masks at the gala. They had a huge crowd, about 500 or so people. And, they focus a lot of their outreach and their work on young people. They have these fellows, the Publius Fellow, the Marshall Fellow, all these various fellows where they have these seminars for young people. And a lot of them came. I would say a good 25 to 30% of them were these young people. So yes, they had a nice crowd, and the audience was very appreciative of Ron DeSantis.
Well, and of course, when we're talking about galas, you have just set yourself up to make a pitch for our gala in Orange County.
So our gala is November 13th. That's a Saturday. And our keynote speaker is Molly Hemingway. And we're also going to honor Larry Elder. And we'll be giving away Molly Hemingway's book and a signed copy. So we hope you can all attend. It's in a couple of weeks. The issue is that we have a smaller capacity venue this time around, and tickets are hot. So if you're interested, please go to our website and register. It's pacificresearch.org.
You can come hang out with us.
Yes, and Tim's going to buy you the next round drink if you come.
We don't know what that is, but we'll have an option by then.
Tim, why don't you make the introduction on the next podcast?
So our listeners may remember a few months back, we played one of these great video conversations that our Evan Harris has as part of our Young Leaders Circle Speakers series, where he reaches out to typically kind of younger minds and those who've thought about issues appealing to young people. And this is a great episode with Jon Miltimore from FEE, and they talk about all things related to the rise of socialism, the rise of, kind of the squad, the increasing popularity of people like AOC and Bernie Sanders among younger voters, and kind of the trends going forward. So it's an interesting discussion on all of these topics related to the rise of socialism and progressivism, especially among young people.
All right. Thanks so much. And here is Evan and Jon.
Everybody, thanks for joining us for another version of Pacific Research Institute Speakers Series. So, as many of you know, we have interesting guests from think tanks, government, emerging industries, tech companies. We talk about a little bit everything. A lot of it is how folks got to where they are. And I think we're kind of switching now with where things are headed with federal policies, state policies, any public policy that's pressing today. So we have great guests today. We're gonna focus on socialism and more economic issues, but we have Jonathan Miltimore, and he's with the Foundation for Economic Education. Jon, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Evan.
Well, Jon, let's kind of jump right in. And you had sent me this recent piece that you said got buried, so I want to bring it back up. But you talked about Venezuela, who I think in the past couple of years has been the boogeyman of communism in South America. Can you take us through your piece? You talked about how basically the economy is turning back to private enterprise and privatization, which might be surprising for folks. But can you kind of run us through why they did that and how they got there?
Yeah, I'll say this, I wouldn't say it's reverting to free market capitalism or anything like that in Venezuela yet. But the story was prompted by a Bloomberg report by two journalists in Caracas. And what they found was that the government is actually turning state assets back over to private hands. Okay. This wasn't a formal announcement by the Maduro government or anything, but they confirmed this with I think they said 9 people in the government, anonymous sources. And again, they were taking assets, everything from coffee processors to farms to hotels, and taking these assets and giving them to private individuals. And why that's so important is, we got to understand Venezuela's history a little bit. They were, let's go all the way back to 1950. It was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It was top 10 in GDP per capita. It had a higher productivity rate than the United States. Things were pretty good. Things changed in the 70s a little bit. They nationalized their oil industry, used the revenue for that to ramp up public spending. But the political situation was pretty stable. It was kind of, I like to refer to it as a flirtation with democratic socialism. It wasn't any kind of full-blown socialism yet. But it kind of turned into a love affair when Hugo Chavez arrived. Chavez was a Marxist, a populist, ran as a democratic socialist, very successfully, was elected 3 times. In 2006, he began the process of nationalizing industries, everything from telecom to mining to tourism. Thousands of private entities were just seized. For a while, people looked at this and thought it was really working. You can find articles in Salon in 2012, for example, that said it's the socialism, the economic miracle of Venezuela. But we saw how quickly that turned. Today, Venezuela is hyperinflation. They're on the verge of mass famine. They have an energy crisis and all these problems. But the Bloomberg report showed that here is the big takeaway, that they're recognizing the state can't plan an economy effectively. What we're going to do is we're going to have people do this for us. We're going to share profits. So I'll let them keep some profit, but it's kind of an admission that central planning does not work.
What I kind of want to take that and look at maybe what's been happening with the U.S. You talked about flirting with democratic socialism. I think we've flirted with it a few times through maybe potential presidential candidates, and definitely on the policy front. I think it's grown more popular here. When we had first talked about doing this, I had thrown out younger generations are more drawn to democratic socialist policies. I think they sound nice. It's the utopia sounding, everyone gets everything. I think Venezuela and obviously many other countries, that's proven that it can't work. Are there any areas in the U.S. economy that feel like they're headed that way? And maybe COVID sped that up too.
I think when you look at things like we've avoided, for the most part, the traditional definition of socialism, right? Where it's the government controlling the means of production. Like there's very few examples of that in the United States. I always talk to people, I say, when you look at, capitalism one side and socialism on the other, it's a continuum. We've never really seen a fully capitalist society. We've never really seen a fully communist one. Like even the Soviet Union, for a while they had like war communism, right? Lenin had war communism, and they quickly realized, well, this is a disaster. And even Lenin started to like look back and say, okay, we need some markets. Like this isn't working. So even the Soviet Union, one of the best examples we have of a socialist empire, they to a degree they still used markets in certain things, in certain ways. Venezuela, is one of those examples. They're further. They have less economic freedom, I think, than any country in the world, with the exception of North Korea. The United States, we're not there yet, but because we have kind of resisted some of the things that you just brought up. Some of there's certain policies out there. If you look at like the Green New Deal, for example, this would be like the state actually controlling huge swaths of the energy sector in ways that would change our system. That would
clean energy, right?
Clean, yeah. And there's
we're doing
the one thing is
climate change. Good.
Yeah, no, I was like, we're seeing more and more clean energy. Solar energy, you probably see a lot of it. California's, economy runs a lot on solar energy, and solar is becoming, through market capitalism, it's becoming far more competitive. And so I think trying to, thinking the government, if we just let them, control things, we'll get a much cleaner economy. I think we need to really be very skeptical of that kind of thinking.
My always big comment on that is, I think the biggest irony, or I'm not even sure the right vocabulary word, is Tesla, and the fact that a purely hyper capitalist / interesting person, and Elon Musk created Tesla, which when you look at the company, you're like, gosh, Democrats, progressives should love this company. It is promoting electric cars. It is promoting the vehicles they want. They want EVs. They want zero emission. Yet in California, they are looked down upon. They are the punching bag because of tax breaks, because they're propped up by the Bay Area. And it's this weird, I don't know if it's a catch-22, but a company that is doing what they want, but because it's a capitalist, it's a more free market company because a person created it, an entrepreneur, it is, and it didn't come from the government, it's looked down upon, which is interesting.
It is, yeah. Tesla's such a unique story, like, and they've had just, the last couple of years, like their market cap
roller coaster
been really something. I come, from the free market space. They always like to beat up on Elon Musk because for the opposite reason, like, oh, he all the subsidies that Tesla's taken, but though it's not Elon's. I've always said, like, it's not Elon Musk's fault that he's taking advantage of these policies. No. I think we should re-examine those policies and say, like, are these needed today? Like, do we really need government propping up, multi-billion-dollar companies? But that's a different conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's a huge can of worms, and like their worker, some of their worker programs and how they treat their workers. So, like, there is a lot more with Tesla, but the weird irony of they're doing what they want, but not the way they want is interesting. You said it a little bit without saying it. Incentives matter. Let's look at jobs. Record amount of open jobs right now. Everywhere I've seen driving around, going to dinner out here, more of your hospitality jobs, everyone's hiring. And I think we know why, but maybe can you take us through how did we get to the point? I think the last report was over 9 million open jobs. Why aren't people going back to work?
Yeah, I think, you were referencing the Wall Street Journal article. I just saw more than 10 million open jobs right now, either 8 or 9 million unemployed people. What's going on, right? Why do we have this record labor shortage right now when we're in an economic recovery? I think you hit it right in the head. It's incentives. John Stossel, the journalist, pointed this out recently. He said, "Don't call it a labor shortage." He said it's an incentive shortage. And what we've done, I forget the name of the act in March that they passed. Not the American Recovery Act. It was a different one. But essentially, they made it easier for workers are going to be more comfortable staying home, and in most cases make more money than they would be going to work. Yep. And Lawrence Summers, who's an economist, the former Harvard president, someone who thinks a lot different than John Stossel, was pointing out way back in March and April that this was going to happen. And so this shouldn't surprise us. And I'll be honest, like if you told me I could go to work, punch in, drive my car, commute back and forth, but I can make more money for not going into work. It's hard to blame Americans for that, even as somebody who values work and sees all the good things that are done. You create value. I think it's good for humans. Going to your job, it creates purpose for us. We learn things from it. So I think it's all good, but it's hard to tell someone, yeah, go to your job, but make less money, when you could just stay at home and play Call of Duty.
I mean, that sounds nice. Or FIFA, if I can give a shout. But no, you're right. It's and I look, while you were talking, I looked it up. I think it was the American Rescue Plan.
That's it. Yes.
Right. The
name stuck out to me because it's such a poor rescue plan.
Well, yes, it is. Maybe not a rescue plan, but I mean, literally, they're all named. I always confused any of the Trump ones from the Biden administration ones. So they need to. Congress's love of names and acronyms knows no bounds, unfortunately. Well, let's real quick.
There is just one second point I'll make quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because inflation, is something that is also in the news a lot today. And I think we saw earlier this week, 5.5% CPI year over year inflation. And everybody's talking about the Fed and the money printing, and that has received a lot of attention, and it should. But the other part of that is what we're talking about, because if you look at the textbook definition of inflation, it's not just more money; it's more money chasing fewer goods,
Yes.
and that's the problem when you have a workforce. When you still have a higher unemployment rate than you should, you have more money, but it's chasing fewer goods and services. So it's not just we have fewer people working. We also have it's causing inflationary problems, which again is something Lawrence Summers, a former Obama official, was talking about months and months ago, and he said this was really an unforced error, and we're seeing today that he was absolutely right.
Well, and to add to that, you have I think it was PepsiCo and Jamie Dillon, like they're saying they're watching inflation, they're concerned, and someone like Pepsi, who has a near limitless supply of products on market that get to consumers, is saying, oh yeah, we're going to have to raise prices to match inflation. It's like, I mean, it's pretty 1 + 1 = 2 there, of that means you and I are going to pay more for everything, yet it doesn't quite get the lip service of the Fed and their balance book expanding and the amount of market share they're taking on. Impact to small business. I mean, I think people, and maybe this is a good question for you. Do you think people don't understand what inflation will do? I think sometimes too, inflation is just kind of this, it's up here and people don't really get it.
Yeah, I think the problem is a lot of the people making the decisions aren't going to be the ones most affected by inflation.
Sure.
And when you look, sometimes we got to step out of ourselves and say, okay, who's really most affected? We're all affected to a degree, right? Like if I go and sign my dinner check, if I go buy a steak, right? We're seeing it, but for other people, like if you're invested in the stock market, if you're a homeowner, in some ways your assets are appreciating, you're not feeling it as much. But if you're that person on, say, Social Security, if you're on a fixed pension, these are the people that are most affected by inflation. But they're not the people that are really, making policy, right? They're just the people that are most harmed by these policies. But I think it's important to remember that inflation is really a problem that hurts the poor the most.
Yeah, no, I'm PRI, the studies we've done, I mean, we completely follow up with that. Similar policies impacting energy, gasoline taxes. It's, the folks on the lower end of the economic ladder literally pay for it, unfortunately. Let's stick with that, but move to minimum wage. And I think that's something, I don't know if you followed the California recall we were talking about before we got started, but Larry Elder, who by the sake of polling is now the Republican frontrunner, he said the minimum wage should be 0, which I think is about the craziest yet funny sounding thing I've ever heard. That might make sense, but minimum wage debate, it's just it's an old debate. It's always arguing that we need to give people at the bottom more versus, well, employers are just going to cut back your hours. You had cited a Harvard study that looked at minimum wage, but could you take us through that, and then maybe you can talk about what you think of Larry Elder's comment too?
Yeah, well, I'll start with Elder's comment. As an economist, I think he's spot on. Yeah. If I'm running Larry Elder's campaign, I'm saying, don't say that, because we know that the American people like minimum wage laws. They look at them as fair and just. They don't see that, like anything, trade-offs. In economics, we always talk about trade-offs. Yes. Sure, you're going to get a higher wage, but what else is being lost? What are the unseen outcomes of that? And we did an article a month or two ago. It was in Harvard Business Journal. And it was a study that came out, I believe it was a California study, or at least California was one of the states analyzed. Texas was another. But basically it showed a lot of things we'd expect. Employers, they're reacting in different ways to higher, minimum wage laws. It used to be, you'd think like, okay, they're just going to let workers go, right? That was the thing. There was always, minimum wage hikes cause unemployment. This study showed that there's not as much of that. What they're doing instead is they're reducing worker hours. And so, employees were finding their hours cut. They were actually making a little bit less money despite a little higher wage. But really the most important part of this was the people that were losing hours were oftentimes losing benefits as well. And this is how employers, here's the thing, if you're a business, you're not going to just take a loss. You're not going to just say, okay, we have this minimum wage law, I guess I'm not going to take a profit. Yeah. So they find ways to circumvent that wage law. And oftentimes, like for some people, the lowest scales, it might mean you do lose your job. Other people are going to lose benefits. And there's some, probably the best workers that just get they get a modest pay bump out of it, and it works in their favor. But these are trade-offs that just, for whatever reason, are just ignored in political conversations. People look at it and say, well, it's just a win-win. But we know if it was that easy, well, why are we stopping at 15? Why not have a $30 minimum?
Sure.
And the economics of it show it's not that simple, but in politics, it's a winner. So Larry Elder, just to go full circle on his comment, it might be one, maybe he loses narrowly to Gavin Newsom because, he kind of didn't, even though he might be right on that issue, he might have made a political blunder by saying that if his opponents run Larry Elder is going to reduce the minimum wage to zero, maybe that catches, with voters.
Yeah, I mean, having not read into the comment and not knowing, I would hope that he was saying that as a theory or rhetorically, it should be zero. But yeah, you probably shouldn't say that out loud. If you're running for governor in California.
We have an article, I wrote this a couple of years ago. The New York Times editorial board said this in 1985. Oh, really? The New York Times editorial board, not this bastion of libertarianism or conservatism, said the real minimum wage should be zero. And it was because these minimum wage laws tend to disproportionately impact the poor in adverse ways. The people with the fewest job skills find themselves on the sideline.
Did Milton Friedman go yell at them and then they wrote that or something?
There was no. Yeah, I wish we could have seen who wrote that editorial. He was probably fired from the Times. A couple years later, but it was a great editorial.
Well, let's shift. Let's say you're president for a day. What is the lasting policy to the American economy that you would change? What would you do?
If I was actually the president of the United States, I'd make a very simple policy, and I'd say we have to actually, interpret the Constitution the way it was written. And we have a Bill of Rights now that sort of establishes the things that our initial Constitution missed. Those problems have been addressed with the 14th Amendment and some other things. But I think I would just have it where if the Constitution does not enumerate that power or the ability to do that, you don't have it. And the founding fathers thought that was enough, right? Like they spelled out exactly the policies that the federal government had. And they had the Bill of Rights there to just to make sure you definitely can't do this. But over time, the Bill of Rights still stands, but the initial Constitution doesn't, because the federal government, pretty much every policy we look at it and say, well, of course the federal government can do that.
Yeah.
And it was really, the first part of the Constitution held up pretty much through the 19th century, but the early 20th century, we saw, that become eroded. Wickard versus Filburn is one of those obscure cases that, some people will remember, but it told.
I'm nodding my head like I know what you're talking about. What is that case? I don't know.
So yeah, Wickard versus Filburn was a Supreme Court case involving a farmer who I think that he was Wickard. He was growing wheat on his own farm, and it was just to for his own animals. It was stock. It was feed for the stock, and the government said you can't do that. And he took it all the way to the Supreme Court, so they don't have a right to regulate mine. And through interstate commerce, because some wheat could eventually, it's in this big market.
Like they were captive.
They ruled that they ruled that the federal government had the power to regulate that, and that was kind of the law or the ruling, I should say, that many people look at as it just kind of opened the door. The federal government, because what doesn't affect interstate commerce to some degree. Yeah. So I think if we just more faithfully followed the Constitution in it the way it was written in that spirit, the federal government wouldn't have the power to do all the things it's so many of the things it's doing today that I think are just are harmful in ways that we don't fully appreciate.
Well, and this is probably we don't need to get in the weeds on this, but you could also argue the power of the White House versus Congress in lawmaking, governing through executive action, OMB, all of that. It's drastically changed. Where I think traditionally the president and Congress fighting, while that still happens, it's the last 10 years it's become a lot different.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
It's funny. Somebody pointed out on Twitter, I think I saw this the other day, basically only one of the three branches still kind of serves the purpose it was initially, designed to do, being the Supreme Court. Because Congress certainly does. And then as your point, like now the executive branch does far more as far as, involved in the legislative process and doing far more than just, faithful execution of laws.
Let's look at the current administration. I was going to ask you, and you can still answer if you want, what's going to happen in 2024. I kind of want to tweak it a little. We're seeing record spending, the American Jobs Plan, the infrastructure bill, the new budget that was passed, which has all types of goodies in it. I think if you're a progressive, we're going to see a massive, probably one of the most massive increases in spending ever. And Biden's talked about this maybe since FDR. And Biden's talked about wanting to be FDR 2.0, a progressive administration. I'll maybe say, do you think by 2024, Biden will have made true on that promise? And I'm maybe not saying that in a good way, but do you think we're headed toward a continued massive expansion in government and spending, federal power?
Yeah, I think, right now, and we know historically when either party controls, both the executive branch and the legislative branch, that their, spending tends to go up. Yeah. And I think we're looking at a huge growth in federal spending, and the bureaucracy is going to grow. I do think these inflationary fears, like the Biden administration is aware of them, and they are sensitive to it. And my hope is that will keep some of their more ambitious plans from being implemented. Sure. Because the truth, we don't have the money to do these things. That means growing more debt, which is already approaching $30 trillion. It means more printing of the Federal Reserve pumping more money. And if we go down that route, we're just going to see more inflation. And again, if they're aware of that now, like my hope is that that'll lead to some pumping of the brakes. That said, I do think in 2024 we're looking at a federal state that is even more massive, and it's going to. What we know is it's really hard once these programs and departments are established. Exactly. Curtailing them is extremely difficult. So it's gonna be a tough couple of years, I think, for people who are fans of limited government and kind of more prudent spending.
Well, before we get to our last question, I wanted to point out again, maybe quickly tell us, you're the editor at FEE. Maybe quickly tell us what you do and where folks can find you, and then we'll get to our last question.
Yeah, all of our content is published at fee.org. And as you said, we're the Foundation for Economic Education. For me, I'm the managing editor there, and we're publishing articles every day. And for people who don't know our shop, like we were founded in 1946 by Henry Hazlitt, one of the great economic writers in history, and Leonard Read, just a very wonderful man. So we've been around, almost since the end of right after the end of World War II, a long time. And for me, like we're sharing just basically like ideas on economics, but not just economics. Like, because I think people think of economics and it's a little boring. Yeah. We're also sharing just the basic virtue of economic freedom. And FEE's motto to me is so beautiful. It's anything peaceful. And we're stressing like a good, healthy society is one where it's based on voluntary action, not coercion. And I think that was, really the spirit of the way our the founding fathers built our country. And it's a vision we've lost. And trying to, teach people again, just the virtue of of trade, voluntary action, not using force. I think there's this philosophy today. We tend to look at government not a necessary evil anymore, but a force for good. But the 20th century is replete with examples of the harm. We look at history and we think we're kind of these more advanced creatures, but we forget that 20th century was the bloodiest history or century in history, and it was largely through people using the topic we started with, socialism. None of these people were trying to build mass graves, by the way. They all thought they were building a better world. They're going to use power. I like to associate it with the One Ring for Tolkien fans, right? I'm going to use the One Ring for good. Just give me the power and we'll build a better society. And we've seen, historically efforts to do that have been disastrous. So I think FEE's mission is just trying to teach these, sound principles in an era when they're kind of being lost.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll note FEE, like you said, is not just economics. Carrie McDonald, who we've had on, focuses on education. So I mean, I enjoy reading your guys' articles, and I'm in the think tank world, but you guys do have a great diversity of thought, of authors. So I would encourage Coach, and that's FEE.org.
You'll find economics, you'll find history, you'll find education, and all these different topics. I think there are ideas that young people in particular are not as aware of, and we try to reach young people. It's not always an easy sell. I don't know many teenagers that are in love with economics, or some. Sure. So we try to find other ways to.
Who are they?
Yeah, exactly. But we do videos as well, like we things in pop culture. And I'm just really proud of our content, and we've had a lot of success here the last couple of years. Our audience is growing rapidly, so it's a lot of fun to do what we do.
And I saw you had an editorial role at the History Channel.
I was the senior editor of the History Channel magazine for 3-4 years, and it was a blast. That's what I studied in both grad school as an undergraduate. Okay. And the problem is the magazine industry, was it's tough, away. Yeah. And so like A&E, terminated our contract with the magazine, and I must have been 2012, maybe 2014, something like that. But it was fun, and for me it was great. I would get invited on trips to go visit, Belgium or historical sites all over. So it was a great gig in a lot of ways. It was just magazines are a tough business, and they're just getting tougher. Ad revenues were tanking, and print costs were going up, and the writing was on the wall. But thankfully, other writing and editing gigs followed.
It's interesting, and I think there's this nostalgia factor now. I actually have it behind me, but Black Rifle Coffee Company, they have a magazine. They have actually great veteran stories and a lot of veterans advocacy. They just did this first print magazine I have behind me. And it's kind of, I think they did it as like a nostalgia. We're releasing a print magazine to buy. And like a lot of people bought it because it's like, oh, it's a real magazine. And they just had a digital only, a digital copy. So it's interesting. I think there is some like magazines trying to come back and do special editions or quarterlies because some people like it, or it's even like a collectible at this point, which seems weird because I don't even think we're 10, 15 years out from magazines everywhere. And now everything's on your Kindle or your phone.
I'd love to see magazines make a comeback. I really would. I'm not, I'm a little skeptical that'll happen just because, there are costs.
Yeah, I don't
it's a difficult place, but I think what you're seeing though, you are going to see, certain places do it. It can be a good marketing tool for some brands. Like if you look, I think Costco has the largest magazine in the country now.
Yeah.
And because it's part of your subscription, and they're always, growing their subscriptions. So I think you'll see more and more companies that kind of just have one. I don't want to say it's a vanity project, but there is a future there.
No, that's fair. And that you're right. It is a marketing tool, but well, let's get the last question. We can get you out of here. There's a lot of progressive proposals, Medicare for all, California universal basic income has become big. And I've always argued, I thought the stimulus checks were the greatest pilot program of universal basic income conducted in the US so far. These types of proposals where it's completely paid for, everyone would get a cut of something. They're popular. They sound nice. What are the downsides? Why should we be worried? While something like that sounds supportive and there should be a safety net of a kind, why are proposals like that potentially dangerous?
Yeah, I think we just need to remember, Milton Friedman was a fan of saying there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Yes.
And it seems free. I wouldn't mind free healthcare. I wouldn't mind free lots of stuff. The problem is you have to take those resources from someone else. You got to take those out of the economy. And what we know is in economics, the resources we're taking out are being used in a more productive way than they can be planned by central planners. I just think Margaret Thatcher had a great quote that a lot of people probably know, but so the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money.
Yep.
And we've seen that time and again, and going back to it, it's a spectrum. You can get away with this for a while. It doesn't, we know there's problems. The more government controls
Absolutely.
the apparatus, the less free market it is, the more economic growth is going to slow. But you can get away with that for a while, but eventually you do have your situations that whether it's Cuba or Venezuela, where an economy falls apart and we see the dysfunction, and oftentimes it's not. Then the whole democratic part of socialism gets lost, and that's sort of like the United Nations makes it very clear. Venezuela today is not a democratic state; it's a dictatorship, and that was the story for a lot in the story of so many of these socialist countries throughout the 20th century.
I think PRI's president says it a lot, but I think it was PJ O'Rourke. He said, if you think healthcare is expensive now, just wait till it's free, which I get nervous that when sometimes that's said and people don't understand it. We need to reteach government 101 in high school, but
it's a great point. And there's, I think it was Mark Perry at American Enterprise Institute did a visual, and it shows all the things that are rising. The costs are rising most rapidly. It's all things that government's controlling. And then you see other things that prices are falling, like television sets and everything else. These things, the more government becomes involved in something, the higher the price goes. And this is what we've seen with healthcare over and over. Costs are through the roof because there's no way to control costs anymore. So if PJ O'Rourke, I get why you'd be nervous, but because people could misinterpret that. But it's absolutely right. Like the less of a market it is, the more expensive it's going to be.
No, it's a great point. John, I'll leave you with the last word, but thanks for having us on. It was a great talk. And I always say, love to have you back on in a couple months when things are even crazier, and we can keep the conversation going.
No, I appreciate you having me on, Evan. It was fun to talk, and I'm a big fan of the work that Pacific Research Institute does. And so I'll have to, check the whole series. I guess my last word would be a question. How long have you guys been doing these?
That's a good question, and no one's ever asked me that. I actually started this last fall because we couldn't do in person anymore. Obviously, I wanted to connect with folks like you or work at other think tanks. I've talked to folks at crypto companies, staffers in Congress. I just more wanted to do some real storytelling and talk to folks about these policies, talk to experts. I'm not an expert in, I feel like, many things. So I we couldn't do in-person events. I couldn't really get speakers. And I'm like, well, this is the next best thing. It's basically a podcast, but it's a way people can talk and hear different opinions, and it's here on a wide variety of topics. And it started more as, hey, how did you get your job in Congress, to I think we're shifting into the impact of policies. And I just think having folks like you on, people will really learn. They'll find other places to get information. I just think that's important. I think
it's a great idea. I'm glad you're doing it. And since you're a crypto guy, any recommendations for me on what I should or shouldn't know?
And if the IRS is listening, I do not own any. No, I actually don't own any. I was more interested in the blockchain space. So my spare time, I was volunteering for an association that they actually work to help government agencies build out blockchain for transparency. But I don't think government agencies tend to really like that. But the technology behind it is more interesting to me. The trading cryptocurrency space, while very interesting, seems insane. And I would say talk to a professional before you go buy something.
I'm invested. I own several, but I'm the opposite of you. I like the trading aspect. I like it as this
People
sort of
can
currency.
call you.
Yeah. But my wife was asking me to describe how it works, and I don't understand the tech enough. I talked about blockchain for a little bit, and she's like, she actually knows a lot more about tech than I do, and It took her about 10 seconds to realize I don't really know what I'm talking about as far as the tech. But I do love the future of crypto. It's one of those things that there's room for optimism with a couple things. One's crypto, one is just federalism. We see states working in a cool way right now. So I think there is reason for encouragement as well.
Well, and this is my view. But to nerd out the blockchain part, I always was attracted to it because of the transparency part. You can't change anything. Well, they call it immutable, but really the aspect of there is a lot more access that the unbanked folks that would never be able to get access to capital or money. And a lot of that more is by country, and maybe not as much in the US, but there's still a lot of people that don't have bank accounts in the US, which I find surprising. So it would, like, best case, this technology could reach them. It's access for money, to earn money, capital, whatever. It'll probably get corrupted, but I mean, that's the optimist viewpoint.
Let's hope not. And just to go back to Venezuela, crypto has been huge down there because they have all the inflation problems. A lot of people are using cryptos and as their money. So I think there is, especially with a lot of the fiat money problems that we're seeing today. Let's hope that cryptos can survive.
Well, it's good to end on. Thanks again, John. It was a good talk, and we'll enjoy inviting you back on again. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks a lot, Evan. Take care.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.